Welcome everyone. Thank you. This is the start of the Do More with Sumo breakout track we have here today at the Modern SOC Summit. So thank you for your attendance and attention. My name's Paul Tobia. I'm a security product manager at Sumo Logic, been doing security for quite a while now. And what I want to kick things off with this track and talk about is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We're going to go over a little bit of what is MITRE ATT&CK, what is MITRE to kind of start out with, why it's so cool, why I think it's a game changer in terms of the security industry. And then at the end, kind of wrap up a little bit with what we're doing with Sumo specifically around the Cloud SIEM and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So to kick things off, when we talk about MITRE, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right, it's kind of important to use that entire phrase, especially when you launch your talk about it. A lot of folks that I hear in the security industry are talking about MITRE or the MITRE framework. Well, actually, the MITRE organization has been around for over 60 years. They actually got their start. They're a not-for-profit organization that's worked with the United States federal government, as I mentioned, for over 60 years. They actually got their start doing radar systems for strategic defense. So if you say MITRE and you really mean the ATT&CK framework, you're kind of letting on that you're a tourist and not necessarily a native in terms of the environment. So ATT&CK framework, MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? You don't have to pronounce the ampersand in there, but you know, please understand, right? MITRE frameworks can mean multiple things, including all the way back to strategic radar systems, missile systems, all sorts of things that the MITRE organization does. But what we're talking about specifically here is this ATT&CK framework. When we talk about the ATT&CK framework, what we're talking about is a knowledge base of tactics, techniques, and procedures. This is kind of flipping things on its head, right? We're talking about the specificity of what an adversary is attempting to do within an environment. There's a lot of data here. If you've dug into the ATT&CK framework, right, we're talking with the latest version, version 9, which came out in April, we've got 367 sub-techniques, 185 techniques, rolling up to 14 different tactics, right? And it's not just the listing of those sub-techniques, but it also talks about the data sources that give you information that show evidence of a particular technique or sub-technique happening. It talks about the threat actor groups that are out there that are actually using this. One of the really cool things about MITRE ATT&CK is that this is based on real world evidence. So when a technique or sub-technique is added to the knowledge base, we've got proof that somebody's seen it out in the wild, that it's actually been used in particular organizations. So that kind of interaction, that kind of reality really kind of grounds this knowledge base. But then they also go into mitigations. How do you fix those things? What are the things that you do to defend? Or if you detect those particular attacks going on in your environment, what do you need to do and what's your next steps? So that entirety of that knowledge base is a huge boon to security practitioners, and it's made available under trademark but completely free, right? This isn't a product. This isn't licensed under any kind of hard licensing or things like that. So it's available for everybody on this call to use. So what's the difference between MITRE ATT&CK and something like a compliance framework, right? Some of my favorites, again, if we want to stay the US centric, right? If we talk about NIST SP 800-53, which is kind of the Uber list of compliance structure that's out there, a lot of things like PCI DSS, HIPAA, stuff like that, even probably the other big Uber one is ISO 27001, right? Those are lists of controls, policies, standards. It is about managing risk within your environment. And depending on the compliance framework that you're working with, right, there's differing levels. There's differing levels of defense that are required or evidence that you need to present to an auditor to show that you're compliant with that particular framework, right? And it focuses a lot on the processes, the technology, and even kind of people parts around defending, around the security side of things. MITRE ATT&CK on the other side is the focus is not on the defense, but the focus is on the offense. The focus is on what is attempting to happen. What are the attacks that are occurring against your particular environment? Now, one of the things I want to touch on briefly is an organization called the Center for Threat Informed Defense that I've got down there at the bottom. They're actually a side project from MITRE that's more of a public-private partnership that's going on that works very closely with the MITRE ATT&CK team and the MITRE Cyber Security Excellence Center that they've got. They've actually put together, and there's a link to the GitHub down there, for a mapping between particular MITRE ATT&CK techniques and sub-techniques over to the controls that are within SP 800-53. So things are related here, but again, it's a differentiation between looking at what are the controls that you need in place from a people, process, and technology standpoint versus what are the attacks that you're potentially going to see from an adversary standpoint. So when we talk about attacks, this is one of my favorite infographics that exists in information security. When we talk about compromise, indicators of compromise, when we talk about detecting attacks that are happening within an environment, right? In 2013, David Bianco put together this idea of this pyramid of pain, this idea that if you're able to elevate the way that you talk about indicators of compromise and the way that you classify and detect indicators of compromise, you make it much harder for the adversary to obfuscate themselves. So all the way down at the bottom, when you've got a hash value, if you're looking at like traditional old school antivirus, right? And you're looking for a particular file that's being loaded onto a disk within your environment, right? Changing the hash value of that particular file is trivial for somebody to do, right? You get into the whole idea of polymorphic code and things like that. Up from that, right? But as you go up the pyramid, it becomes more and more difficult to obfuscate, to hide that an attack is occurring or what kind of attack is occurring. So as you go up the pyramid, up to the IP addresses and domain names, and then get into the host and network artifacts where you're starting to detect patterns of traffic that are happening across, right? That's harder to block those things. But then you get all the way up to the tools, right? And Mimikatz is Mimikatz, right? If you're pulling out those cache credentials, right? That tool has a particular signature and detection that can occur in there. And if you're not using Mimikatz and you're using something like Mimikatz, that's where you get all the way up to the tip of the pyramid, which is the TTP, stands for tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? Where you're not talking about the tools that are being used or the artifacts that are being shown or where you're coming from in terms of domain names and IP addresses or the payload that you're trying to send in terms of hash values, but you're actually talking about what is occurring within the environment. What are those procedures that they're using specifically during an attack, which are evidenced by particular techniques that are trying to attempt a tactic, that are trying to attempt something that they're trying to do, like lateral movement or initial compromise, those sorts of things. So getting into an actual example of an attack technique, right? Something that's relatively recent, right? When we talk about the SolarWinds issues that happened towards the end of last year, MITRE actually updates the attack framework on 2 times a year. Usually in the spring. The last one that they did was towards the end of April, and then in the fall around September. But because of the SolarWinds issue, they actually did kind of an emergency patch version of MITRE ATT&CK that included some of these techniques and sub-techniques in here, like I'm showing you right here, where this supply chain compromise of the software supply chain, right? So you've got the technique that's there, and then the specific sub-technique under it. It's defined by an ID, that technique 1195, and then the sub-technique is the .002. That ties up to that tactic, which is initial access. You can think of the tactics kind of almost, it's pretty closely aligned with a cyber kill chain, right? But again, this is being provided under a license that isn't controlled by Lockheed Martin and copyrighted and trademarked all up and down the way. So it's a little more freer to use those tactics as your own kill chain. But again, I want to focus on that this is a very specific instance, right? When you're talking about, when somebody talks about the SolarWinds issues that occurred, right, towards the end of last year and, you know, still potentially happening, this is something very specific. This is something very specific that we're talking about. The Sunspot malware was designed and used to insert Sunburst, which is the payload, into software builds of the SolarWinds Orion IT management product, right? And creating a taxonomy around that very specific attack, around that very specific technique, right, is how you classify this as part of a supply chain compromise technique, and specifically compromising the software part of the supply chain. So continuing on, right, a little more, perhaps not as timely, but an oldie but a goodie, right? The concept of spear phishing. How does spear phishing work, and how is that classified and shown within this taxonomy? And again, we're talking about specific instances that are occurring, right? And they're building the taxonomy around those specific instances, whether they're done through the private-public partnership, through the Center for Threat-Informed Defense, whether it's extracted from publicly known or semi-classified, you know, semi-private threat intelligence reports that occur out there. So the latest and greatest attacks that are occurring, right? The MITRE team and the attack team keeps an eye on all of those publications and all of those updates, and does work towards classifying and categorizing those things. And when new things are found, right, that's how you get those new techniques and sub-techniques. The cool thing is that a lot of organizations with their threat intelligence reports are actually starting to classify things under the MITRE ATT&CK framework as well. So that translation step doesn't need to occur. But again, back to this, right, we're talking about APT39, which is a threat group, right, specifically leveraging spear phishing emails with malicious links to initially compromise victims. So again, you get down to the technique, which is phishing, and the sub-technique, which is this very specific spear phishing link. And that shows, right, so not only provides you that information about what the attack is, but what platforms are potentially affected, what are the data sources that allow you to detect that this particular sub-technique is occurring within your environment, right? So there's things like the DNS records that you can find, web proxy records, email gateways, packet capture, et cetera, et cetera. So the capability to take what's going on in your environment, whether you're talking about whatever data source you particularly have, whether it's intrusion detection, whether it's some cloud monitoring systems like CloudWatch or Cloud Security Command Center or AWS Guard Duty, Azure systems that are out there, right? The idea that you can roll these particular events and attacks that are occurring within your environment, or potential attacks that are occurring in your environment, into this unified idea of these techniques and sub-techniques, allows you to approach what's potentially happening within your environment and kind of taking the vendor out of it, taking the vendor jargon out of that. So as I mentioned, ATT&CK comes out with new versions, usually on twice a year. And they do a great job of keeping this up to date, right? This is, I believe they're pushing 4 or 5, probably more years. I'm a little fuzzy on the total date that ATT&CK has been around. And every year it gets better, and every year more and more people are using it. As I mentioned, the most recent update happened in April, towards the end of April, and this is ATT&CK version 9. One of the things that I really liked that they did around this is that they're getting a little bit more away from Windows focus, right? It's very seem to be very sysmon biased, right? Very low level process management, EDR kind of focus on Windows endpoints. And there's a lot of great work in the security industry that's been done around those sorts of things. So that's the place where all the threat intelligence is occurring. That's the place where all of the latest and greatest attacks are being detected. And the MITRE team, the MITRE ATT&CK team, you know, focused on that area and has been kind of the bulwark of what the MITRE ATT&CK framework has turned out to today. But the awesome thing is that they're moving with the times and they're moving with the punches, so that they're understanding more and more about other operating systems like Mac OS, starting to get into Linux as well. Again, from that process managing standpoint, again, it goes along with the industry. Additionally, right, they're focusing more on cloud, which is near and dear to Sumo Logic's heart, right? But it's also, you know, definitely the next frontier, right? A lot of what we're talking about today in the Modern SOC Summit is that intersection of cloud with on-prem in terms of day-to-day security operations. So previously in Attack V8 and before, right, they were talking about the big three. They were talking about AWS, they were talking about Azure, and they were talking about GCP. Now they've de-vendorized those cloud service providers to just talk about IaaS, infrastructure as a service in general, right? So if you've got Alibaba services that are out there, if you're running off of Oracle or IBM, right? Any of the other non-big three out there, then this is still relevant to you. It's not specifically talking about the big three cloud service providers, but more generally talking about all service providers. They're also starting to look at APIs as well, and not just look at logs in terms of data sources to be able to detect these particular techniques and sub-techniques. Drilling into that a little bit more, and this is, you know, we've only got a couple minutes here, so I'm not gonna drive into it, but the idea of how do you detect a technique happening within the environment. A lot of times before, they would just provide a data source and then say, you should be able to get these, you should be able to detect these events and detect these relationships and detect these techniques and sub-techniques from this data source. Now they're starting to drill down further into not just data source, but the idea of data components and the relationships amongst the elements within those components, right? So to get down to closer to those ideas of a process created a process, a user created a process connected to an IP, et cetera, and then taking that as those atomic level detections that you can do to provide how those connect into the techniques and sub-techniques. If you've got a specific thing, like you're looking over on the right-hand side with the green boxes, right, you can see that there are Windows event codes for that. But there are things that occur within a Linux system that are evidenced by logs as well, that happen within potentially even like an AWS CloudTrail system that shows you those same sorts of events and relationships occurring. So it shouldn't be limited to just one vendor or just one platform. And then the last thing is that they're starting to get into containers, right? So this is again through that Center for Informed Threat Defense, that public-private partnership. There's also a lot of Microsoft in here as well. They came out with their own container matrix, which was some of the basis for this as well. So the idea that you can look at these things not just within the lens of the traditional security operations and the security detections, right? This is what your IDS shows you, this is what your firewall shows you, but more along the lines of containerization. So you're looking at things that are happening on a host OS, or you're looking at things that are happening with your orchestration system, right, a Docker or Kubernetes, or you're managing the images that you're using to build those containers, right, the runtime of the containers themselves. It's turtles all the way down. At the eventual end, right, you're looking at processes and users and IP addresses and things like that. But being able to provide this kind of a lens towards it, right, really helps us focus on and expand the knowledge base of the security industry as a whole into containerization security, into microservices security, up to Kubernetes and things like that as well. So here at the last part of it, right, I want to talk briefly about what we're doing with Sumo Logic around attacks. So we actually take a look. So in the Cloud SIM product that we have, our rules that create detections, which we call signals within the Cloud SIM system, we tie those things to techniques. Not quite down to sub techniques yet. That's an advancement that we're continuing to work on. But looking at the tactics and the techniques, when we generate a signal within Cloud SIM Enterprise, right, we're going to tag those things. It's a relatively new feature that we've got that can add metadata to a bunch of the data objects that are within the Cloud SIM. And we've actually tied together. I'll switch over to the demo here. We've actually loaded into the system the entire techniques, sub-techniques, systems, the structure from the MITRE ATT&CK GitHub. So we actually update this on a fairly regular basis when they update theirs as well. So when you come into, this is kind of the inbox, right? We're on the advanced do more with Sumo Logic. So when you look at the inbox of your insights that are here, you see right front and center, right, which tactics and which techniques are related to that particular insight that you're looking at. So you know that there's some password spraying going on here, that there's some malicious file execution going on with this particular insight. And the cool thing is, right, is that we've even got links straight off, right? So one-stop shopping, getting over to MITRE's database or knowledge base to find out, right, what are the mitigation things that you can do? How has detection occurred, right? And again, if you even want to go all the way back to those references, that the reason why that they created or why they put these things in here in the first place. Full screen is a lot of fun on a Mac. So, okay, so back on the list here, right, showing you that the insight, right, the capability to do a search based on these tactics. So if you actually click on the tag itself, it'll send you off and it'll actually create a filter here to show all of the insights that you've had, right, that have included that particular tactic that's going on. And same thing with techniques and sub techniques. But when you actually drill into the insight as well, right, because insights within Cloud SIM are collections of signals that have occurred, then you can see the breakdown of each of the signals and the particular tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques that are related to those as well, right? So this is all provided out of the box, right? And the information that we've got, this entire structure is here, but it also allows for folks who are customizing the system. So if you're creating your own rule sets, you can bind particular techniques and sub-techniques to the rules that you create or the rules that you modify as well. So we're not relying just on our stuff, right, to provide this. You've got access to these things. You've got access to these things as well. So let me just wrap it up here. I've got one more slide to show you. All right, last slide down here. So we've got plenty of documentation out there if you want to dig into the schema that we've got out there for the entities and the insights. Some of our colleagues here at Sumo have done other blog postings on how you can use MITRE in your Cloud SIM content and specifically around AWS. And then of course the MITRE blog itself and the attack framework is out there too. So, you know, interesting sites if you want to continue to drill down there, and we will continue to use those techniques and sub-techniques and do advancements around Cloud SIM and security intelligence platform in general, more and more into MITRE. So thanks everybody for your attention. I really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of the SOC Summit, and give you a little break here as, oh, looks like we maybe have a question. Question around API access to the metadata. Yes, in general, when you access a signal or insight, it's going to provide you the JSON blob that's going to include the tagging information that's going to be in there. So we will include the tag information, which will be the MITRE ID and the name of the technique, tactic, or sub-technique that's in there. It'll be up to you from that point, although we may provide a URL to the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. But it will primarily be up to you to then take that ID and reference the external system, right? We don't want to create a copy of that. It's available on GitHub. It's available on MITRE's website. They're able to provide that information directly. So, but you can definitely, from a signal or from an insight via API, we'll provide that tagging information in there. Yes.